If you enjoy the content, please like the video and subscribe to my channel Nightmare Archives. Rachel Clark checked her backpack one final time before locking her car. Water bottles, trail mix, first aid kit, compass, extra socks, maps, printed in digital in her portable charger. All there, all accounted for. She glanced at her watch, 7:42 a.m. Perfect timing to hit the Blackwater Ridge Trail before the weekend hikers showed up. She inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp mountain air that carried the scent of pine and earth. This was why she came here. This was what she needed after weeks of deadlines and office politics. Just her in the mountains. No meetings, no emails, no anxious clients calling at all hours. Eat hours, she said aloud as she adjusted her backpack straps. 8 hours of actual peace and quiet. The morning sun filled through the trees as Rachel signed the trail register at the head of Blackwater Ridge. She noted the time and her expected return, just after sunset. Only 2 other names were scrawled above hers in the register, both from yesterday. This remote trail in the Cascade Mountains wasn't popular like the touristy paths closer to Seattle. That's precisely why she'd chosen it. She took a photo of the trailhead sign for her Instagram, though she wouldn't post it until tomorrow. Rachel had learned the hard way that advertising solo hikes in real time wasn't smart. 3 years ago, someone had broken into her apartment while she was on a day-long hike she'd documented on social media. Since then, she'd become more cautious about her digital footprint. The trail began with a gentle incline through a dense forest of cedar and fir. Shafts of sunlight cut through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Rachel settled into her rhythm quickly, her boots finding sure footing on the familiar terrain. She'd hiked parts of Blackwater Ridge before, but never the full 16-mile loop that ventured deeper into the wilderness. 2 hours in, the trees thinned slightly and the trail curved alongside a ridgeline that offered glimpses of the valley below. Rachel paused, breathing hard from the steady climb, and took in the view. From here, civilization seemed like a distant concept. The sprawling forest stretched to the horizon, uninterrupted by roads or buildings. Mist clung to the distant peaks, giving them an ethereal quality that made Rachel reach for her phone. She captured several shots, already mentally selecting which one would be worth the precious battery life to edit and save. As she tucked her phone away, a voice behind her nearly made her jump. "Spectacular, isn't it?" Rachel turned to face a man she hadn't heard approach. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with a lean build and sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the edges of his navy blue cap. His smile revealed a slight gap between his front teeth. "Sorry," he said, raising his hands apologetically. "Didn't mean to startle you." Rachel returned a small smile, her heart rate steadying. "No worries. I was lost in the view. Easy to do out here." The man gestured toward the valley. "Makes you realize how small we are." He wore hiking pants and a lightweight blue jacket. Appropriate gear, Rachel noted. Nothing about him seemed immediately alarming, but years of solo hiking had taught her to maintain a friendly caution with strangers on the trail. "I'm Daniel," he said, extending his hand. "Rachel," she replied, shaking it briefly. His hand was cool despite the warming day, heating around the full loop. Daniel asked, nodding toward the trail ahead. "That's the plan. You?" "Same here. I try to do this trail at least once a season. It changes so much with the weather." He adjusted his cap, squinting against the sunlight. "You hiking alone?" The question, though common on trails, always put Rachel slightly on edge. "Yes, but my boyfriend knows my route," she lied smoothly. "He's expecting me to check in at certain points." "Smart," Daniel replied, seemingly unfazed by her subtle caution. "I usually hike solo too. There's something about being alone out here that resets everything, you know?" Rachel nodded, relaxing slightly. Most hikers understood the appeal of solitude. "Well," Daniel continued, "I was about to take a quick break. Don't let me keep you if you're trying to make good time." "Actually, I was thinking of taking a water break myself," Rachel said, unslinging her backpack. She was slightly ahead of schedule and felt comfortable enough to pause. Besides, Daniel seemed like a typical hiker, probably harmless, possibly even good company for a few minutes. They sat about 6 feet apart on a fallen log that overlooked the valley. Rachel pulled out her water bottle and took a long drink. She noticed that Daniel didn't reach for water, but instead leaned back on his hands, face tilted toward the sun. "So what brings you out to Blackwater?" Rachel asked, making polite conversation. "Besides the seasonal changes. Work's been intense," Daniel replied, his eyes still closed against the sunlight. "I needed to clear my head, and you can't beat this place for getting perspective." "What kind of work?" Daniel opened his eyes and turned to her. For a brief moment, his expression seemed to flicker with something unreadable before his easy smile returned. Environmental consulting. Lots of reports, lots of bureaucracy. Not nearly enough of this. He gestured to the wilderness around them. What about you? Graphic design. I work for a marketing agency in Seattle. Creative type, huh? I can see that. Daniel nodded as if this explained something about her. You've got a good eye. I saw you taking photos earlier. Their conversation flowed naturally as they discussed favorite hikes in the region. Daniel seemed knowledgeable about the area, mentioning trails that even Rachel, who considered herself experienced, hadn't heard of. There's a path about 2 miles ahead that branches off the main trail, Daniel said as they prepared to continue hiking. It adds about 40 minutes to the loop, but it follows this incredible ridgeline that most people miss. The views are worth it if you've got the time. Rachel checked her watch. She was still making good time, and the weather forecast had promised clear skies until late evening. Sounds interesting, she said, genuinely intrigued. I'm always up for the scenic route. Great, Daniel smiled. It's easy to miss the turnoff if you don't know what you're looking for. I can point it out when we get there. They continued along the trail together, falling into an easy hiking rhythm. Rachel noticed that Daniel matched his pace to hers without seeming to try. They weren't quite hiking together. More like two solo hikers who happened to be going the same way at the same time. Have you lived in the Pacific Northwest long? Rachel asked as they navigated a rocky section of the trail. On and off for about 8 years, Daniel replied. You, born and raised in Seattle, but I've only been serious about hiking for the last 5 years or so. What got you started? The question was innocent enough, but Rachel found herself giving the abbreviated version of the story she usually told. Just needed an escape from the city. Started small and got hooked. She didn't mention the real catalyst, toxic relationship that had left her seeking solitude and reclaiming her independence through solo adventures. Those details seemed too personal to share with a trail acquaintance. Daniel nodded as if he understood completely. The mountains have a way of helping us find ourselves again. The calm and oddly perceptive made Rachel glance at him with renewed curiosity. He was looking ahead at the trail, his expression contemplative. As they continued hiking, Rachel noticed something unusual. Daniel carried only what appeared to be a small day pack. Minimalist even for an experienced hiker tackling a 16-mile loop. No visible water bottle, no bulges suggesting extra layers or food supplies. Traveling light? She asked, nodding toward his pack. Daniel smiled. I've got the essentials. I don't need much these days. They rounded a bend in the trail, and the path narrowed as it hugged the mountainside. Daniel stepped aside to let Rachel go first, which she appreciated. It was proper trail etiquette, allowing the uphill hiker the right of way. So, Rachel said over her shoulder, you mentioned environmental consulting. What does that involve exactly? There was a brief pause before Daniel answered. Oh, mostly field assessments, impact studies, making sure development projects don't completely destroy natural habitats. His tone shifted slightly, becoming more detached. What about you? What kind of design work do you do? Rachel noted the deflection but didn't press further. Brand identity mostly. Logos, websites, marketing materials. Some UI/UX work for apps. Sounds creative, Daniel replied, his interest seemingly renewed. Do you enjoy it? Most days, Rachel said honestly, though lately I've been thinking about freelancing. Having more control over my projects and time. Freedom is underrated, Daniel agreed. Most people trade it away without realizing what they're giving up. They hiked in comfortable silence for the next 20 minutes, the trail gradually climbing higher. Rachel's legs were beginning to feel the burn of the consistent incline, but she welcomed the physical exertion. This was what she'd come for. The satisfying fatigue that cleared her mind and relaxed her body in a way that no gym workout ever could. It should be coming up soon, Daniel said, breaking the silence. The turnoff I mentioned. Rachel checked her GPS app. They were still on the main Blackwater Ridge Trail, but her map didn't show any official branches at this section. Is it a marked trail? She asked. Not officially, Daniel admitted. More of a local secret. Trust me, it's worth it. Something in his phrasing, trust me, made Rachel hesitate. She'd always been cautious about going off established trails, both for safety and environmental reasons. I don't know, she said carefully. I usually stick to marked paths, leave no trace in all that. It's an established path, Daniel assured her. Just not on the park maps. Plenty of locals use it. It actually reconnects with the main loop about 2 miles ahead. And the views. He let out a low whistle. Absolutely worth the detour. Rachel weighed her options. Her instincts weren't raising any serious alarms about Daniel. He seemed like a genuine hiking enthusiast, knowledgeable and respectful of the trail. And the idea of seeing something off the typical tourist path was appealing. "There it is," Daniel said, pointing to what appeared to be a subtle game trail veering off to the right. If he hadn't pointed it out, Rachel would have walked past without noticing it. She hesitated, looking down the faint path that disappeared into thicker forest. "It opens up after about a quarter mile," Daniel explained, noting her hesitation. "The trees thin out, and you can see across 3 valleys from the ridge. Most people miss it entirely." Rachel pulled out her phone to check the time and her location. She had plenty of daylight left, and she was still on track to complete the loop before sunset, even with a detour. "All right," she decided. "Let's check it out, Bot." Daniel smiled, that slight gap between his front teeth visible again. "You won't regret it." As they turned onto the unmarked path, Rachel made sure to drop a pin on her map app, marking the junction where they'd left the main trail. The underbrush was thicker here, brushing against her hiking pants as they picked their way through. "So how often do you do solo hikes?" Daniel asked as he ducked under a low-hanging branch. "As often as I can get away," Rachel replied. "Usually twice a month. More in summer. Friends not into hiking. Some are, but they can't always make it. And honestly, I prefer going alone sometimes. It's," she searched for the right word, "cleaner somehow. No compromising on pace or when to take breaks." Daniel nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. No waiting for someone who packed too heavy, or dealing with someone who wants to rush through without appreciating anything." The path gradually began to climb more steeply, and the conversation paused as they both focused on negotiating the increasingly challenging terrain. Rachel noticed that Daniel moved with unusual grace over the rough ground, barely making a sound despite the carpet of dry leaves and twigs. After about 15 minutes on the unofficial trail, the dense forest began to thin as Daniel had promised. Rachel could see glimpses of open sky ahead through the trees. "Almost there," Daniel said, glancing back at her with an eager expression. "You're going to love this." The path emerged onto a narrow rocky ridgeline, and Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The view was spectacular, more dramatic than the main trail's overlooks. 3 valleys spread out below them, with layers of mountains receding into the distance, each range a deeper shade of blue than the one before it. "Worth the detour?" Daniel asked, though her expression had already answered his question. "Absolutely," Rachel admitted, reaching for her phone to capture the panorama. "This is incredible." She took several photos, turning slowly to capture the full 360-degree view. Daniel stood at the edge of the ridge, looking out over the valleys with his back to her. Rachel framed a shot with him as a silhouette against the dramatic landscape, thinking it would make a compelling composition, the solitary figure contemplating the vastness of nature. "Mind if I get one with you in it?" she asked. "For scale." Daniel turned, and for a split second, Rachel thought she saw reluctance cross his features. But then he smiled. "Sure, go ahead." She took the photo, then scrolled back to review it. The landscape looked stunning. The rolling mountains, the play of light and shadow across the valleys. Perfect, except, Rachel frowned, zooming in on the image. Where Daniel should have been standing was empty space. She looked up quickly, confirming he was still there, then back at her phone in confusion. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, taking a step toward her. "Yeah, just..." Rachel turned her phone to show him. "That's weird. The photo didn't capture you for some reason." Daniel glanced at the screen, his expression unreadable. "Trick of the light, maybe. Or your camera's HDR, trying to balance the bright sky with the darker foreground." The explanation sounded plausible enough, but something about the perfect emptiness where he should have been standing unsettled Rachel. She took another photo, making sure to focus directly on him this time. Again, the result showed only the landscape, no Daniel. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air crept up Rachel's spine. She lowered her phone slowly, looking at Daniel with new eyes, noticing details she'd overlooked before. No water bottle. No sweat on his brow despite the challenging hike. The way he deflected personal questions. "We should keep moving if we want to complete the loop before dark," Daniel said casually, seemingly oblivious to her growing unease. He gestured toward where the narrow path continued along the ridge. "The trail gets even better from here." Rachel glanced back the way they'd come, mentally calculating. They'd been off the main path for about 20 minutes. If they turned back now, they'd rejoin the official trail quickly, and she could continue her hike as originally planned. "Actually," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think I'll head back to the main trail. I want to make sure I complete the full loop before sunset." Daniel's smile remained fixed, but something in his eyes changed. A subtle hardening that made Rachel's pulse quicken. "It's faster to continue this way," he said. "This path reconnects with the main loop up ahead, I mentioned. Turning back now would waste time." Rachel adjusted her backpack straps, buying herself a moment to think. "I'd still prefer to stick to the marked trail. I'm not comfortable going further off route." Daniel was standing between her and the path back to the main trail. He hadn't moved, yet somehow his presence felt more imposing than before. "It's safer if we stay together out here," he said, his voice still friendly but with an underlying firmness that hadn't been there before. "You never know who you might run into." The statement, intended to sound concerned, sent another wave of unease through Rachel. She forced a smile. "I appreciate the company, but I'm pretty experienced with solo hiking. I'll be fine." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. The spectacular view that had seemed so worth the detour minutes ago now felt isolating, a reminder of how far they were from other hikers, from the safety of the maintained trail. "Well, if you're sure," Daniel finally said, stepping aside with a shrug that appeared too casual. "I was enjoying the conversation, but I understand if you want to go back." Relief washed over Rachel as the tension broke. She nodded, already taking a step toward the path back to the main trail. "Thanks for showing me this spot, though. You were right about the view. Maybe we'll run into each other back on the main loop," Daniel said, not moving to follow her. "The trail circles back on itself eventually." Maybe." Rachel agreed noncommittally. "Enjoy the rest of your hike." She headed back down the narrow path they descended, walking quickly without looking back. The forest seemed darker now, the underbrush thicker than she remembered. After a few minutes, Rachel paused to check her phone, confirming she was heading in the right direction, according to the pin she dropped. That's when she heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps behind her. Rachel turned, half expecting to see Daniel following her. The path behind her was empty, but the distinct sound of movement continued for a moment before stopping abruptly. "Hello," she called out, hating how her voice wavered slightly. No response, only the distant cry of a hawk and the whisper of wind through the trees. She quickened her pace, keeping her eyes fixed on her phone's map as she navigated back toward the main trail. The 20-minute detour now felt like miles, each step taking her deeper into forest that seemed increasingly unfamiliar. When Rachel finally emerged onto the wider, clearly marked Blackwater Ridge Trail, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She checked her location against the trail map. According to her GPS, she was exactly where she should be, back on the official route. She took a moment to drink some water and calm her nerves. The encounter with Daniel, strange as it had become, was over. She had a beautiful day ahead of her and 8 more miles of spectacular hiking to enjoy. No reason to let one odd interaction ruin her day. Rachel continued along the main trail, her pace brisk as she worked to put distance between herself and the unmarked path. The sun had risen higher, warming the air and dappling the forest floor with patches of golden light. Gradually, her tension began to ease as she fell back into the familiar rhythm of hiking. Left foot, right foot, breathe, repeat. An hour passed. Rachel stopped at a designated viewpoint to eat her lunch, a simple meal of trail mix, an apple, and a protein bar. The view wasn't as dramatic as the secret ridgeline Daniel had shown her, but it was beautiful in its own right, and somehow more comforting for being on the official path. As she packed away her lunch wrapper, Rachel heard voices approaching, the first other hikers she'd encountered all day. A middle-aged couple rounded the bend, nodding friendly greetings as they passed. "Beautiful day," the woman commented. "Perfect," Rachel agreed, feeling the last of her unease dissolve with the simple human interaction. The couple continued on, and Rachel shouldered her pack to resume her hike. She had just stepped back onto the trail when a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "I was wondering when you'd stop for lunch." Rachel froze. Daniel stood a few yards away, leaning casually against a tree as if he'd been there all along. "How did you?" she began, then stopped. The couple had just come from that direction. There was no way Daniel could have passed them without her noticing. "I told you the trails reconnect," he said with that same gap-toothed smile that now seemed anything but friendly. "Beautiful spot for lunch, isn't it?" Rachel's mind raced. The couple was still within shouting distance. If she called out, they would hear her. But what would she say? That this man was following her. He would deny it, say they were both just hiking the same trail. she would sound paranoid. "I'm going to catch up with that couple," Rachel said firmly, pointing in the direction the hikers had gone. "They're friends of mine." Daniel's expression didn't change, but he straightened up from the tree. "No, they're not." The simple contradiction sent ice through Rachel's veins. He was right. They weren't her friends, but his certainty, the way he'd called her bluff so effortlessly, rattled her. "Enjoy the rest of your hike, Rachel," Daniel said, stepping aside to clear her path. His eyes never left hers. "I'm sure we'll see each other again before the day is over." But it wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a promise. Rachel walked past him without responding, her legs moving automatically while her mind whirled with confusion and rising fear. She didn't look back, but she could feel his gaze following her until she rounded the next bend in the trail. Once out of sight, she broke into a jog, determined to catch up with the couple ahead. Their presence represented safety in numbers, a buffer against whatever strange game Daniel seemed to be playing. She rounded another curve in the trail, expecting to see the couple ahead. The path stretched empty before her. Rachel stopped, breathing hard. They couldn't have gotten that far ahead already, unless they'd turned around and she'd somehow missed them, or taken another trail that branched off. But there were no other marked paths in this section. She was sure of it. Rachel pulled out her map again, confirming her location. No, this was the only trail. The forest suddenly seemed very quiet. She took out her phone, intending to call someone, anyone, but the no service indicator mocked her from the top of the screen. Of course, she rarely had reception this deep in the mountains. Rachel put her phone away and took a deep breath. She was letting her imagination run wild. Daniel was just another hiker on the same trail. Odd, yes, but not necessarily dangerous. The couple had probably just moved faster than she'd expected. She would either catch up to them eventually or not. She continued hiking, more alert now, paying closer attention to her surroundings. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made her turn, half expecting to see Daniel materializing from the forest. The trail began to descend gradually, winding its way through a section of older forest where the trees grew larger and the undergrowth thinned. Rachel checked her map again. She was about halfway through the loop now, heading back in the general direction of the trailhead, though still miles away. As the path curved around a massive cedar, Rachel spotted something that made her stop short. Daniel stood in the middle of the trail about 30 yards ahead, his back to her, completely motionless. He wasn't hiking, wasn't looking at the scenery, just standing as if waiting. Rachel backed up silently, ducking behind the cedar tree. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he would hear it. How had he gotten ahead of her? She hadn't passed him, and she hadn't seen any shortcuts or alternate routes on the trail. She peered around the tree. Daniel hadn't moved. He remained perfectly still, like a statue in the middle of the path. Rachel weighed her options. Going forward meant confronting whatever Daniel was doing. Going back meant retracing miles of trail, ensuring she wouldn't complete the loop before dark. Neither option felt good. As she hesitated, Daniel slowly turned around, as if sensing her presence. His gaze seemed to find her immediately, despite the distance and the tree partially concealing her. He smiled and raised his hand in a small wave. Rachel stepped out from behind the tree, realizing how futile hiding had been. She raised her hand automatically in response, the social programming to be polite kicking in despite her fear. "Thought I'd wait for you," Daniel called, his voice carrying easily through the still forest. "This next section has some great views." The implication was clear. He expected them to continue hiking together. Rachel's mouth went dry. She thought of the photo again, the empty space where Daniel should have been. The way he kept appearing ahead of her on the trail. His lack of water or proper gear for a 16-mile hike. Something was very wrong with this situation. Rachel touched the bear spray attached to her backpack strap, the familiar shape of the canister reassuring under her fingers. She'd never had to use it against wildlife, but its presence had always given her confidence while hiking alone. Now, she wondered if it would work against whatever Daniel was. "I'm going to head back," she called, keeping her voice steady. "I think I dropped something earlier." Daniel took a step toward her. "I can help you look." "No," Rachel said quickly, too quickly. "That's okay. I know where it is." She turned and began walking rapidly back the way she'd come, no longer caring if her fear was obvious. Behind her she heard no pursuit, no footsteps following. Just Daniel's voice, calm and almost amused, floating after her. "See you soon, Rachel." But Rachel's boots pounded against the dirt trail as she maintained a brisk pace, constantly glancing over her shoulder. Her earlier enjoyment of the hike had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread that tightened her chest with each passing minute. The forest that had seemed so peaceful that morning now felt oppressive, the dense trees creating too many shadows, too many places where someone or something could hide. She checked her watch, 2:37 p.m. Still plenty of daylight left, but the knowledge offered little comfort. The trail stretched ahead of her, winding back toward the main loop she'd been following before her encounter with Daniel. Her mind replayed their interactions, searching for clues she might have missed. The missing reflection in the photo, his lack of water or supplies, the way he kept appearing ahead of her on the trail without explanation. Get it together, Rachel, she muttered to herself, trying to quiet the rising panic. There's a logical explanation. But what if there wasn't? What if the man following her wasn't what he appeared to be? Rachel pushed the thought away. She needed to focus on practical matters. Getting back to the main trail, putting distance between herself and Daniel, eventually reaching her car at the trailhead, one step at a time. After 15 minutes of steady hiking, Rachel paused to check her location on her phone's map. According to the GPS, she'd made good progress backtracking along the trail. She should be approaching the junction where the main path split into the loop very soon. As she studied the map, a twig snapped somewhere in the forest to her left. Rachel's head jerked up, her eyes scanning the trees. The dense undergrowth revealed nothing, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Someone was watching her. She could feel a hello. She called out, immediately regretting the sound of her voice breaking the silence. No response. Just the distant call of a bird and the whisper of wind through the treetops. Rachel put her phone away and continued hiking, faster now. The trail curved around a large boulder, and as she rounded it, she nearly collided with Daniel, who stood directly in her path. Rachel stifled a scream, stumbling backward. How did you? Daniel smiled, seemingly unperturbed by her reaction or by the impossibility of his presence. Changed your mind about going back? Good choice. The view ahead is much better than what's behind us. Cold fear settled in Rachel's stomach. She had been heading back toward the trailhead. There was no way Daniel could have circled around to get ahead of her without her noticing. Stop following me, she said, her voice low and tense. I don't know what your deal is, but I want to hike alone. Following you. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression one of innocent confusion. I'm just hiking the same trail, Rachel. It's a loop, remember? Eventually everyone crosses paths. The casual dismissal of what they both knew to be true ignited a spark of anger that cut through Rachel's fear. That's bullshit. You keep appearing out of nowhere, and you didn't show up in my photo earlier. Daniel's smile faltered slightly. Camera glitch, it happens. No, it doesn't, Rachel said, her hand moving slowly toward the bear spray on her backpack strap. Who are you? What do you want? Daniel took a step toward her, and Rachel immediately stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. We both know what's happening here, Rachel, he said, his voice dropping slightly. You're an experienced hiker. You know the rules. Stay on the path, be prepared, don't hike alone. He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. Sometimes there are consequences for breaking the rules. Rachel's fingers closed around the bear spray. Get out of my way, she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice despite the fear coursing through her. I'm heading back to the trailhead. It's safer if we stay together. Daniel insisted, his friendly demeanor returning. Like I said before, you never know who you might run into out here. I'm going back, Rachel repeated firmly. No, move aside. For a long moment they stood facing each other, the tension between them almost tangible in the still forest air. Then, slowly, Daniel stepped aside, gesturing for her to pass with an exaggerated politeness that felt more threatening than accommodating. As you wish, he said. But remember, this trail has a way of bringing people together, whether they want it or not. Rachel moved past him quickly, fighting the urge to run. She could feel his gaze boring into her back as she walked away, but she refused to look behind her. Distance. She needed distance between them. Once around the next bend in the trail, Rachel broke into a jog, her backpack bouncing uncomfortably against her shoulders. She didn't care. She needed to put as much space as possible between herself and Daniel. After several minutes, she slowed to catch her breath, lungs burning from the exertion. She dared a glance back. The trail behind her was empty. Rachel leaned against a tree, trying to calm her racing heart. She pulled out her water bottle with shaking hands and took a long drink. The cool liquid helped clear her head. She needed a plan. The trailhead was still hours away at a normal hiking pace. If she maintained a fast walk, maybe she could make it back before. Before what? Before dark. Before Daniel found her again. Rachel checked her phone again. Still no service. She couldn't call for help, couldn't text her location to anyone. She was on her own. Continuing forward, Rachel's mind raced through her options. She could try to find other hikers, safety in numbers. But she'd seen almost no one all day except for that couple, who had mysteriously disappeared. Was that Daniel's doing somehow? The idea that he might have done something to couple sent a fresh wave of fear through her. What exactly was she dealing with here? Rachel rounded another bend in the trail and stopped short. Something was wrong. The path ahead didn't look familiar. The trees were different. Older, more gnarled, with thick underbrush crowding the edges of the trail. She checked her map again, confirming she was still on the Blackwater Ridge Loop. According to her GPS, she was. But the surroundings didn't match her memory from earlier that day. Had she somehow taken a wrong turn? Rachel zoomed out on the map, studying the entire loop. No, this was definitely the main trail. She hadn't veered off onto any side paths, unless... A cold realization crept over her. What if Daniel had been subtly leading her off trail all along? What if the path she was on now wasn't the official Blackwater Ridge Trail at all, but something else entirely? Rachel's eyes darted frantically from her screen to the unfamiliar forest around her. The GPS showed her on the trail, but technology could be wrong. Maps could be outdated, and someone who knew these woods well enough could deliberately lead a hiker astray. She dropped to a crouch, pretending to tie her shoe while she quickly typed out a text message with her location and sent it to her roommate, Ellie. Hiking Blackwater. Strange man following me. GPS cords attached. If you don't hear from me by 8 p.m., call Rangers. Rachel hit send, watching as the message attempted to deliver. The spinning icon continued for several seconds before the dreaded, "not delivered," appeared. No signal, of course. Rachel stood up, a new determination hardening within her. If she couldn't call for help, she would have to help herself. She had her bear spray. She had a pocket knife in her backpack. She was fit, experienced, and knew these mountains better than most weekend hikers. Whatever game Daniel was playing, she wasn't going to be an easy target. She continued hiking, more alert now, scanning the forest continuously while also watching the trail for any signs that might help her confirm her location. A marked tree, a distinctive rock formation, anything that would match her memory from the morning. After another 20 minutes of hiking, Rachel came to a small clearing where the trail forked. This wasn't right. According to her map, there should be no fork here, just the continuous loop of the Blackwater Ridge Trail. Rachel stared at the junction, confusion and dread building within her. The fork wasn't on her map, which meant she was no longer on the official trail. Somehow Daniel had led her miles off the marked path. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This had never been a chance encounter. Daniel hadn't just happened to be hiking the same trail at the same time. He had been waiting for someone like her, a solo hiker, isolated and vulnerable. As if summoned by her thoughts, Daniel's voice came from behind her, having trouble deciding which way to go. Rachel whirled around. Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing, leaning casually against a tree. His relaxed posture contrasted sharply with the predatory intensity in his eyes. "Where am I?" Rachel demanded, her hand moving to the bear spray. "This isn't the Blackwater Ridge Trail," very observant, Daniel said, pushing himself away from the tree and taking a step toward her. "We left that trail behind quite some time ago." "That's impossible," Rachel said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "I've been following my GPS." Daniel smiled, that gap between his teeth no longer seeming charming but somehow sinister. "Technology is only as reliable as the information it's given, Rachel. These woods have their own rules, their own paths." "What do you want from me?" Rachel asked directly, her fingers wrapping around the bear spray canister. Daniel took another step forward. "Just your company for now. This forest gets lonely." The implication behind his words sent ice through Rachel's veins. For now, what came after "no" was something she had no intention of discovering. "I'm leaving," she said firmly. "I'll find my way back to the main trail." "Neither of those paths leads back to Blackwater Ridge," Daniel said, gesturing to the fork in the trail. "But by all means, choose one. I enjoy the chase," but the word "case" broke something inside Rachel. The last thin barrier between reasonable caution and primal fear. In one fluid motion, she pulled the bear spray from its holster, pointed it directly at Daniel, and began backing away toward one of the forking paths. "Stay back," she warned, her finger on the trigger. "Don't follow me." Daniel's expression darkened, but he made no move to pursue her. You can't stay lost forever, Rachel. Eventually, you'll need to find shelter. Waterway home. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. And I'll be waiting. Rachel continued backing away until she reached the fork in the trail. Making a split-second decision, she chose the left path, turned and ran. She sprinted down the unfamiliar trail, her boots pounding against the dirt, branches whipping past her face as the path narrowed and grew more overgrown. She had no plan beyond putting distance between herself and Daniel, no destination except away. After several minutes of hard running, a stitch burning in her side, Rachel slowed to catch her breath. She listened for sounds of pursuit, but heard nothing beyond her own ragged breathing and the distant call of birds. The trail she'd chosen continued to narrow, becoming little more than a game path winding through increasingly dense forest. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the canopy above, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor that shifted with each breath of wind. Rachel checked her phone again. Still no signal, and the battery was down to 42%. She needed to conserve it, but she also needed her map. She opened the GPS app one more time, trying to get her bearings. According to her phone, she was now nearly 3 miles off the official Blackwater Ridge Trail. The nearest marked path was a service road used by forest rangers, approximately 2 miles east of her current position. 2 miles through untracked wilderness, but it was her best chance. If she could reach that road, she might find help or at least a clearer path back to civilization. Rachel took a deep breath and oriented herself eastward, using the compass app on her phone. Then she tucked the device away to save battery and stepped off the narrow path into the forest. Moving through the underbrush was slow, exhausting work. Branches caught at her clothing, hidden roots threatened to trip her with each step, and the uneven ground forced her to constantly adjust her footing. But Rachel pushed on, driven by the knowledge that Daniel was somewhere behind her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to grow tired, to give up. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, Rachel paused to rest. The forest had grown quieter, the bird calls less frequent as evening approached. She checked her phone again. Still heading east. Still no signal, battery now at 36%. She took a careful sip from her water bottle, rationing it. She had started the day with 2 full bottles, but the unexpected detours and the stress of fleeing had caused her to drink more than planned. One bottle was now empty, and the second was half gone. As Rachel screwed the cap back on, a twig snapped loudly to her right. She froze, straining to hear over the sound of her own heartbeat. Another snap, closer this time. Rachel slowly turned her head toward the sound. Through the trees, approximately 30 yards away, she caught a glimpse of movement. A flash of blue that exactly matched the color of Daniel's jacket. He had found her. Already. Rachel remained absolutely still, hoping the underbrush would conceal her. How had he tracked her so quickly? She'd been careful not to leave an obvious trail, had moved in a straight line rather than following any path. The blue flash appeared again, moving steadily closer. Daniel was paralleling her course, circling around to cut her off. Rachel crouched lower, her mind racing. She couldn't outrun him. That much was clear. He moved through these woods with an unnatural ease, as if the forest itself was guiding him. She needed another strategy. Slowly, carefully, Rachel eased herself backward, using a large fir tree as cover. Then another, and gradually putting more trees between herself and the approaching figure. Once she'd created enough distance, Rachel changed direction, heading southeast instead of due east. If Daniel was tracking her from the north, she might be able to circle around him and still reach the service road. She moved as quietly as she could, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid snapping branches or rustling leaves. The fading light made it harder to see obstacles, but it also provided better cover. After 20 minutes of this painstaking progress, Rachel paused again to get her bearings. The forest had grown darker, the shadows deeper as the sun sank toward the horizon. She checked her phone one last time. Battery at 29%, still heading in the right general direction. As she put her phone away, a voice spoke directly behind her. "You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be, Rachel." She whirled around, bear spray raised, but Daniel was faster. His hand closed around her wrist, with a grip so cold and tight that it felt like metal rather than flesh. He squeezed until her fingers opened involuntarily, and the bear spray fell to the forest floor. "Let go of me," Rachel shouted, pulling against his grip. Daniel's face was calm, almost apologetic. "I can't do that. Not until you understand what's happening here." "I understand perfectly." Rachel spat, still struggling. "You're some kind of psycho who gets off on terrorizing women in the woods." A flicker of something, amusement, disappointment, crossed Daniel's face. Is that what you think this is? Some simple human predator and prey scenario? He shook his head. You still don't see it, do you? Rachel stopped struggling, realization dawning. See what? Daniel's grip on her wrist loosened slightly. Look at me, Rachel. Really look. In the fading daylight, Rachel studied the man before her. Daniel's appearance hadn't changed. Same lean build, same gap-toothed smile. But something about him seemed different, as if she were seeing him with new clarity. His edges seemed less defined, as if he were slightly out of focus compared to the sharp details of the forest around them. What are you? She whispered. Daniel released her wrist. I'm part of these mountains. I've been here since before your trails were carved, before your maps were drawn. His voice had taken on a hollow quality that seemed to echo despite the dense forest surrounding them. I wait for those who come alone, those who think they understand these woods. Rachel took a step back, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. That's not possible. The photo, Daniel said simply. You saw the truth then. I don't appear in your technology because I'm not something that can be captured that way. Rachel thought of the empty space in her photo where Daniel should have been standing. Not a camera glitch, not a trick of the light. Evidence of something impossible. Why me? She asked, her voice barely audible. You were alone, confident, unafraid. Daniel took a step toward her. The fearless ones are always the most interesting to follow. Rachel's survival instincts kicked in, overriding the paralysis of fear that had momentarily frozen her. In one quick movement, she bent down, snatched up the bear spray from where it had fallen, and discharged it directly into Daniel's face. The orange chemical cloud engulfed him, but Daniel didn't react the way a human would. He didn't scream or claw at his eyes. He simply stood there as the spray passed through him like mist through a projection. That doesn't work on me, Rachel, he said, his voice tinged with something that might have been pity. Nothing physical does. A pure terror surged through Rachel. If he couldn't be harmed by physical means, how could she escape him? The answer came in a sudden moment of clarity. She couldn't fight him, but she could still run. Rachel turned and bolted through the forest, no longer caring about the noise she made. Behind her, she heard Daniel's voice, calm and certain. Run if you want to, Rachel. It makes no difference. Thus she crashed through the underbrush, branches scratching her face and arms, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. The rational part of her mind knew it was hopeless. Daniel had found her easily before, would find her again. But the primal need to flee overrode all logic. The forest grew darker as she ran, the last of the daylight fading rapidly. Rachel stumbled on a hidden root and went down hard, pain shooting through her ankle. She bit back a cry, scrambling to her feet and testing her weight on the injured limb. Not broken, but definitely sprained. Each step sent sharp pain up her leg, but she pushed through it, hobbling forward. Through the trees ahead, Rachel caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong in the wilderness. Straight lines, right angles. A structure. Hope surged through her as she limped toward it. As she drew closer, the shape resolved into a small, dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls weathered gray with age, its single window dark and empty. Rachel approached cautiously. The cabin looked abandoned, its door hanging slightly ajar, the small porch sagging under the weight of years of neglect. It might have been a hunter's shelter, or a ranger outpost long forgotten by the Forestry Service. It wasn't safety, not really. A wooden structure couldn't keep out whatever Daniel was, but it was better than being completely exposed in the rapidly darkening forest. Rachel pushed the door open wider, wincing at the loud creak of rusted hinges. The interior was a single room, furnished only with a crude wooden table, an old cast-iron stove, and what might have once been a cot but was now just a metal frame with a few rotted strips of canvas. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. To her surprise, there was a simple sliding bolt on the inside of the door. Rachel secured it immediately, knowing it was a flimsy barrier but taking what little protection she could get. In the center of the table lay a rusted hunting knife, its blade dull but still intact. Rachel picked it up, testing its weight in her hand. Like the bear spray, it probably wouldn't harm Daniel, but having a weapon, any weapon, provided a small measure of comfort. As darkness fell completely outside, the cabin became pitch black. Rachel fumbled with her phone, turning on the flashlight feature despite her dwindling battery. She needed to see, to make sure she was alone in the small space. The beam of light confirmed what she had initially observed, just the table, stove, and broken cot. No other doors, no hidden corners where someone could be waiting. Just the single window, its glass long gone, now covered with a piece of splintered plywood that let in drafts of cold night air. Rachel's ankle throbbed painfully as she lowered herself to the floor, her back against the wall opposite the door. She kept the hunting knife in her right hand, her phone in her left, its light illuminating the empty cabin. The silence of the forest at night pressed in around her, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of nocturnal creatures. Rachel strained to hear any sound that might indicate Daniel's approach, but there was nothing unusual, nothing out of place in the natural symphony of night sounds. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Rachel's eyelids grew heavy despite her fear. The adrenaline that had fueled her flight was ebbing, leaving behind bone, deep exhaustion. She fought against it, pinching her arm, shifting positions to send fresh pain through her injured ankle. Anything to stay awake, to stay alert. She checked her phone. 11:30 p.m., battery at 14%. She would have to turn off the flashlight soon to conserve what little power remained. The thought of sitting in complete darks made her stomach clench with fear, but she had no choice. Rachel switched off the light, plunging the cabin into blackness so complete she couldn't see her hand in front of her face. She tensed, listening intently to the sounds of the night forest, her grip tightening on the hunting knife. That's when she heard it. Footsteps on the porch outside, slow and deliberate. Rachel held her breath, pressing herself harder against the wall as if she could somehow melt into it. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, Daniel's voice came through the thin wooden barrier, as clear as if he were standing beside her. "You can't stay in there forever, Rachel." She didn't respond, didn't move, barely breathed. "The night is long," Daniel continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried perfectly to her ears. "And I have all the time in the world." The doorknob rattled gently, testing the lock. The bolt held, but Rachel had no illusions about how long it would keep him out if he truly wanted to enter. Outside, Daniel began to pace, his footsteps moving in a slow circle around the cabin. Rachel tracked the sound, turning her head to follow his progress as he moved from the door to the window, then around to the back wall, and finally completing the circuit. He repeated this pattern again and again, each circuit bringing him closer to the cabin walls, until she could hear his breathing through the gaps in the aged wood. Rachel clutched the knife with white-knuckled intensity, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Hours passed this way, with Daniel circling the cabin like a predator, sometimes speaking, saying her name, commenting on the cold night, reminding her that dawn was still far away, sometimes simply breathing, letting her know he was still there, still waiting. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, Rachel's exhaustion won out over her terror. Despite her desperate fight to stay awake, her eyelids drooped, her head nodded forward, and she drifted into a fitful sleep, the hunting knife still clutched in her hand. She dreamed of running through endless forest, of paths that circled back on themselves, of Daniel always ahead of her, always waiting around the next bend. In her dream, she called out for help, but her voice made no sound, and the trees grew taller, closer, until they became a prison of wood and leaf. Rachel jolted awake, disoriented, her neck stiff from sleeping upright against the wall. Pale gray light filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls. Dawn had come at last. She listened intently but heard no footsteps, no breathing, no evidence that Daniel was still circling outside. Had he left? Or was he simply waiting, knowing she would have to emerge eventually? Rachel checked her phone at 6:07 a.m., battery at 7%. She needed to make a decision. Stay in the cabin and hope for rescue that might never come, or take advantage of the daylight to try to find her way back to civilization. The sprained ankle complicated matters. It had stiffened overnight, and when Rachel tentatively put weight on it, pain shot up her leg. She could walk, but not quickly, and certainly not run if Daniel appeared again. But staying meant certain disaster. No food, no water beyond what remained in her bottle. No way to call for help. She had to try. Rachel stood carefully, testing her injured ankle. It would support her weight, though every step would be painful. She tucked the hunting knife into her backpack's side pocket where she could reach it quickly, then moved to the door. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening for any sound outside. Nothing but the normal morning chorus of birds. Slowly, Rachel slid the bolt open, the metal scraping loudly in the quiet cabin. She pushed the door open a crack, peering out at the small clearing where the cabin stood, empty. No sign of Daniel. Taking a deep breath, Rachel stepped outside into the cool morning air, scanning the tree line for any movement. The forest looked different in daylight. less menacing, more navigable. She could see now that the cabin sat in a small natural clearing, with what might have once been a path leading away to the east. That would be her route. East toward the service road that her map had shown, and hopefully toward help. Rachel adjusted her backpack and started walking, each step sending a throb of pain through her ankle. She moved as quickly as she could, constantly glancing behind her, expecting to see Daniel materialize from the trees at any moment. But the forest remained empty of human presence as she made her slow, painful progress toward what she hoped was safety. Rachel's hands trembled as she clutched the rusted hunting knife, its weathered handle slick with her sweat. The cabin's single room offered little protection. Just 4 walls of splintered wood and a door with a lock that seemed laughably inadequate now. The only window was boarded shut, leaving her in near darkness save for slivers of moonlight that crept through the gaps in the wooden slats. Rachel. Her name floated through the night air, the voice almost conversational. Daniel was circling the cabin again, his footsteps deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. You can't stay in there forever, Rachel. She pressed her back against the wall, willing her breathing to quiet. How did he know her name? She'd been careful not to mention it during their hike. Had she slipped? No, she was certain she hadn't. The realization sent a fresh wave of nausea through her body. He'd known who she was before they'd even met. The footsteps paused outside the single window. A shadow fell across the thin beam of moonlight streaming through the boards. I know you're listening, Rachel. It's just you and me out here, miles from anywhere. His voice dropped to a whisper, miles from anyone. As she squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the knife tighter. Don't respond. Don't give him anything. Do you want to know how many others I've met on these trails? The shadow shifted, and she could almost picture him leaning casually against the cabin wall. Some were smart like you, some weren't. But they all made the same mistake in the end. Rachel's mind raced, cataloging her options. The cabin offered temporary safety, but Daniel was right. She couldn't stay forever. No food, no water, and no one knew where she was. Her phone battery showed 12%, but without signal it was useless for calling help. Something scratched against the wooden walls. Fingernails, perhaps, or the tip of a blade. The sound moved slowly around the perimeter of the cabin, a deliberate act meant to unnerve her. Did you know, Daniel continued, his tone eerily pleasant, that most people who go missing in national parks are never found. The wilderness just swallows them up. Rachel fought back tears, THNK. She wasn't going to become another statistic, another mystery for true crime podcasts to dissect. The scratching stopped abruptly. Then came a new sound, the metallic click of something being set down outside the cabin door. I brought you some water, Rachel. You must be thirsty by now. Her parched throat tightened at the mention of water. How long had it been since she'd last drunk? Hours. She dropped her pack during the chase, losing her supplies. It's right outside the door. Just open up and take it. Rachel stared at the door, hating how tempted she felt. It was such an obvious trap, yet her body screamed for hydration. No, thank you, she managed, her voice hoarse but steady. A soft laugh drifted through the walls. She speaks. I was beginning to think you'd gone mute with fear. Why are you doing this? The question escaped before she could stop herself. Why? Daniel's voice took on a thoughtful quality. I suppose it's like asking why a hawk hunts mice. It's simply the natural order of things. The footsteps resumed their circuit around the cabin. Rachel stayed frozen in place, listening to his movements, trying to predict what would come next. The others asked the same question. He continued, as if understanding my motives would somehow save them. But the why doesn't matter, does it? Only the what happens next. A sudden, violent beat against the door made Rachel jump. Then another. He was testing the door's strength. This cabin won't protect you forever, Daniel called out, his friendly facade slipping. These walls are rotting. This door is weak, and I'm very, very patient. Rachel scanned the room frantically. There had to be something else she could use, a weapon, a tool, anything. The cabin was nearly bare, a broken chair, a small table, an ancient wood stove. Nothing that would give her an advantage. The pounding stopped. Silence stretched, heavy and ominous. Had he left? She strained to hear any sound, any indication of where he might be. Minutes passed. The silence continued. Rachel didn't trust it for a second. She crept toward the boarded window, careful to avoid the creaking floorboards she'd mapped in her mind during the long hours of night. Pressing her eye to a slim gap between the boards, she tried to see outside, but the darkness revealed nothing. More minutes passed. Then an hour. The silence grew more unsettling than the stalking had been. Her legs ached from standing tensed for so long. Carefully, she lowered herself to sit on the floor, her back still pressed against the wall, knife at the ready. She needed to conserve her energy if, when she got her chance to run, she would need every ounce of strength. Despite her terror, exhaustion began to pull at her. She fought against it, pinching her skin, biting her lip, anything to stay alert. But after the grueling day of hiking, running, and fear, her body betrayed her. Her eyelids grew heavy. Just a moment, she thought. Just a moment to reset. Rachel jerked awake with a gasp. Light was streaming through the gaps in the boarded window. Dawn. She'd fallen asleep. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet, knife at the ready. The cabin was silent. No footsteps outside. No whispered threats. She pressed her ear to the door. Nothing. He given up, left to find easier prey. She didn't believe it for a second. This might be her only chance. With sunrise came the possibility, however slim, of encountering other hikers if she could make it back to the main trail. Staying meant certain death by dehydration or at Daniel's hands when he inevitably broke in. Rachel eyed the rusted knife. Its edge was dull, but it had been sharp enough to draw blood yesterday. It would have to do. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The main trail had to be east of the cabin, or was it north? Her mental map was fuzzy after the panic chase through the woods. She'd have to use the rising sun to orient herself. With trembling fingers, she inched the door's lock back, wincing at every tiny sound it made. If a Daniel was waiting just outside, she'd have only one chance to use the knife before he overpowered her. The lock disengaged. Rachel held her breath, counting down in her head. 3, 2, 1. She yanked the door open and burst outside, knife raised, ready to fight. Empty. The small clearing around the cabin was deserted, and an opened water bottle sat on the ground where Daniel had left it. Rachel ignored it, her eyes scanning the tree line for any movement, any sign of him. Nothing. Don't trust it, her instincts screamed. He's waiting, watching. The forest stretched in all directions, dense and impenetrable. The morning light barely filtered through the thick canopy, casting long shadows that could easily conceal a predator. Rachel oriented herself with the rising sun and chose a direction that she prayed would lead to the main trail. She gripped the knife tightly and began to move, not running. Running would be too noisy, too conspicuous. But walking quickly, deliberately, every few steps she glanced behind her, expecting to see Daniel emerging from the shadows. The forest was eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. As if everything was holding its breath, waiting. She'd covered perhaps half a mile when she heard it, a twig snapping somewhere behind her. Rachel froze, straining her ears. Another snap, closer now. He was tracking her. All pretense of stealth abandoned, Rachel broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at her face, roots threatened to trip her with every step. But she pushed on, driven by pure survival instinct. Behind her, she heard him giving chase, moving through the forest with the confidence of someone who knew these woods intimately. "You're going the wrong way, Rachel," Daniel called, his voice much too close. The trail's in the opposite direction. Was he lying? Trying to confuse her? She couldn't trust anything he said, but doubt crept in. What if she was running deeper into the wilderness, away from any chance of help? A clearing appeared ahead. Rachel burst through the tree line, momentarily blinded by the sudden brightness of direct sunlight. When her vision cleared, her heart sank. She'd run in a wide arc, somehow circling back toward the cabin. It stood about 200 yards away, its weathered woods stark against the green of the forest. She'd lost her bearings completely. Before she could choose another direction, something slammed into her from behind. Rachel crashed to the ground, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. The knife spun from her grasp, landing just out of reach. Daniel's weight pinned her down, his breath hot against her neck. "That was quite a chase," he panted, sounding almost impressed. "You're stronger than you look." Rachel thrashed beneath him, fingers clawing desperately toward the knife. Daniel grabbed her wrist, twisting until she cried out in pain. "I've been watching you for days," he whispered, his voice sickeningly intimate. "Following you on the trails, learning your routines. You always hike alone, always so confident. I knew you'd be perfect." Rachel bucked violently, trying to throw him off, but he was too heavy, too prepared for her resistance. "The others gave up so quickly," he continued, disappointment coloring his tone. "But you have real survival instinct." His grip on her wrist tightened as his other hand moved to her throat, fingers pressing against her windpipe. Rachel gasped for air, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. "It's nothing personal. Daniel murmured, almost apologetic. This is just what I do. As consciousness began to fade, a sudden clarity washed over Rachel. If she passed out, she was dead. This was her last chance. With her free hand, she grabbed a fistful of dirt and leaves, twisting just enough to fling it directly into Daniel's eyes. He recoiled instinctively, his grip loosening for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Rachel wrenched her body sideways, throwing him off balance. Her fingers closed around the knife handle. Without hesitation, she swung it upward, aiming for any part of him she could reach. The blade sank into his thigh. Daniel howled, more in surprise than pain, his hands releasing her to clutch at the wound. Rachel scrambled to her feet, not waiting to see how badly she'd hurt him. She ran, the sound of his curses fading behind her. This time, she followed the sunrise more carefully, forcing herself to maintain a straight line despite the obstacles in her path. The trees began to thin. The ground underfoot changed from soft forest floor to harder packed earth, and then mercifully, she saw the faint outline of a trail cutting through the woods. Not the main hiking trail, but a fire road, the kind used by park rangers and emergency vehicles. It had to lead somewhere. Rachel staggered onto the dirt road, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Scratched and dehydrated, she forced herself to keep moving. Every few steps, she looked back, expecting to see Daniel emerging from the trees, knife in hand. A sound reached her ears, the distant rumble of an engine. Rachel stumbled toward it, waving her arms frantically as an old pickup came into view around a bend in the road. The truck slowed its driver, a man in his 60s with a weathered face and suspicious eyes, peering at her through the open window. "Please," Rachel gasped, aware of how she must look, wild-eyed, covered in dirt and blood. "Please help me. Someone's after me." The man's eyes narrowed, taking in her appearance. For a horrible moment, Rachel thought he might drive away, leaving her to her fate. Then he reached across and pushed open the passenger door. Jet in. Rachel practically collapsed into the seat, slamming the door behind her. "Drive," she pleaded. "Please just drive." But the man gave her another long look, then nodded, pressing his foot to the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, carrying them away from the forest. "What happened to you?" he asked after they'd put some distance between themselves and the tree line. Rachel's hands shook uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to ebby. "I was hiking. A man. He attacked me. Chased me through the woods all night." But the man glanced in his rearview mirror. "You want me to call the Rangers? They can send someone out to look for this guy. Wes, please." Rachel closed her eyes briefly, the reality of her escape beginning to sink in. "He's hurt. I stabbed him in the leg, but I don't know how badly." "Good for you," the man muttered, reaching for his cell phone. "No signal here. We'll call when we get back to the main road." Rachel nodded, too exhausted to speak further. She stared out the window as the truck bounced along the fire road, the forest blurring into a green haze. Had she really escaped? It seemed impossible after the night of terror. Half an hour later, they reached the main road. The man pulled over at a ranger station and helped Rachel inside, where a startled park ranger immediately called for medical assistance. The next few hours passed in a daze of questions, statements, and examinations. Yes, she could describe her attacker. No, she didn't know his real name. Yes, she was certain he'd meant to kill her. Search parties were dispatched to the area around the cabin, but Rachel already knew they would find nothing. Daniel, or whatever his real name was, would be long gone, his leg bandaged, his hunting ground temporarily abandoned. By evening, Rachel sat in her own living room, the familiar surroundings doing little to ease the knot of fear that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. The police had escorted her home, checked her apartment, and promised to patrol the area for the next few days. They'd taken her statement and copies of the photos from her phone. Useless images that showed only empty forest where Daniel should have been standing. "We'll find him," the detective had promised, but his eyes said otherwise. Without a clear photo, without fingerprints or DNA, without even knowing if Daniel was his real name, the case would likely go cold. Rachel sat in stunned silence, a mug of untouched tea growing cold between her trembling hands. Every creak of the building made her flinch. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up with a notification. "New photo available in your cloud storage." Rachel frowned. She hadn't taken any photos since. With a sense of dread building in her stomach, she picked up the phone and opened the notification. The photo loaded slowly, the image gradually coming into focus. It was her car, parked at the trailhead where she'd left it yesterday. The photo had been taken from the edge of the forest, partially obscured by trees. The timestamp showed it had been taken just hours ago. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she noticed a small white rectangle tucked under her windshield wiper. A zoomed-in view revealed a handwritten note. "Next time, Rachel. There's always a next time." As she dropped the phone as if it had burned her, backing away until she hit the wall. He knew where she lived. He knew her car. He had access to her cloud storage. This wasn't over. Rachel slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, eyes fixed on the phone as if it might spring to life. The detective's card lay on the table beside it. She should call him, report this new development. But what could they do? Put her in protective custody forever. She would always be looking over her shoulder, always wondering if today was the day Daniel would return to finish what he'd started. Outside her window, dusk was falling, shadows lengthening across the street. One of those shadows shifted slightly, or had she imagined it? Rachel reached for her phone with shaking fingers. She would call the detective. She would change her name, move to a new city, never hike alone again. But as the phone rang, unanswered, she knew with cold certainty that none of it would matter. Daniel was patient, and he had chosen her. The forest had let her escape this time. There wouldn't be a second chance.